Welcome back to Media 7, where I'm talking about the way banks fare in the media with Tim Hunter, Andrew Campbell and Bernard Hickey. In this week's Take 2, Sarah Daniel looks at the ways that banks have sought our good opinion.
Banks and finance companies, they're all over the TV news like a rash.
Mere details.
Not always in the news, but sponsoring the news. There's the one with the black horse. ASB.
Live long and prosper, sir.
ASB Business. TSB. Kiwi Bank.
Let's go get 'em!
Before the storm clouds gathered, even the weather was sponsored by a finance company.
This One Weather update is brought to you by Hanover Finance,
Here's Richard Long.
a company built on many years of experience.
Now, how many people put their trust in Long before they put their hard-earned savings into this finance company?
It'll blow you away!
Here's Current Affairs brought to you by a finance company. Banks and finance companies like getting into bed with news journalists too. Here's Ian Fraser.
A question of money.
Actually, Ian, it's a question of credibility. We borrow from the banks, and the banks in turn borrow credibility from the news. No one ever tells lies in this time slot.
Because today's big interest is in peace of mind.
This thoroughbred has not yet crapped in the living room, but in the case of the finance companies, the horse bolted, and the punter's hard-earned money went down the dunny.
There's quite enough mischief for today.
Sarah Daniel there. Well, Tim, were you watching that, wishing you had a sponsor for your business section?
Certainly not. I find it incredible that a news bulletin would seek sponsorship from any organisation, let alone one that they're likely to be required to report on objectively. And I think it's a sign, perhaps significant, that you can't imagine something like the Sunday Star Times or the New Zealand Herald brought to you by ASB. I mean, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? So
Although I must say the Herald website was brought to you by Vodafone a few weeks ago. So.
Well, maybe I'm not up to date on that, but I think it's a very pernicious trend, and if I was a media executive, I'd be very concerned about that.
So, Bernard, have you got a disclosure there?
I have, yes. We have a video section which is published on YouTube and on our website called 90 at 9, which is sponsored by ASB. And I disagree that a sponsorship is any different to an ad slapped on a full page on a newspaper or at the bottom of a section. The New Zealand Herald, for example, usually has an ad right at the bottom of the front page, which often is in yellow or green or whatever it is, advertising a bank. And I don't see the difference between an ad slapped all over a newspaper and a sponsorship on a TV show.
Wouldn't there be considerable embarrassment if you've got your newscast sponsored by a particular bank and then you've got a big news report strongly critical of your own sponsor? Yep. And wouldn't that make you think twice about whether you'd actually run that newscast or edit it slightly? Or
Yep, we face this issue very closely because my role with interest.co.nz is to focus on how the banks are doing with interest rates and other things. And we in our organisation have a very strict separation between advertising and editorial. And regularly I write stories critical of the banks and in some cases critical of ASB. And the best example of that is a piece I did a few weeks ago called 5 Reasons to Thank the Banks and 5 Reasons to Spank the Banks, which you can Google if you like. And we do that. So, and in fact, ASB have told us that one of the reasons they like sponsoring us is because we are seen as independent. I think journalists have to be aware that if they're a commercial operation and carry advertising, there is going to be pressure. They just have to push back at it and set up the structures so there is a separation of church and state.
Now, not all those banks that we saw in that montage there have gone the route of picking a trust figure and to make themselves look credible. Kiwi Bank went a different way and played on nationalistic feelings. What did you make of that campaign? I'm not sure it's worked.
No, I think most New Zealanders have worked overseas, work with people who are from overseas, and this old idea that New Zealanders, hate people from overseas or don't like the idea that others are running our banks or any other part of our country. I just think it's harks back to a xenophobic era. You've also got to be careful when you do this because the moment you use an international service, let's say for example Kiwi Bank uses an Australian ad agency, which it has, or outsources some of its KiwiSaver call centre work to Australia, which it has, it risks damaging its core message.
Yeah,
so
risk being hoist by its own
that's
petard.
right. I'm not actually a big fan of Kiwibank's campaign, this big anti-Australian thing. I think they're much better to stand up and say, hey, we have the best rates in the market and the best service in the market, and we keep the profits in New Zealand.
Andrew, from the union's point of view, are Kiwibank any different?
I think in terms of the objectives that our union has set, so our members have identified a whole lot of things around what we would like the banking industry to look like, and I think that Kiwibank meets more of those objectives than a number of, than the Australian banks, and that's partially or mainly to do with the way in which they operate. Just going back to your earlier question though, I guess as a union, so an organisation that's often commenting on the banks, our assessment would be that particularly with the television news, there has been some crossover in editorial decision making. I mean, a good example actually is the story about our petition yesterday. Now, not saying we should be in every news outlet, but every major radio network, newspaper in the country ran that story. Neither TV1 or TV3 did.
That's because they don't cover business news properly.
Well, they very rarely, particularly TV1, it's not unusual to get a story on TV3, but ever since National Bank's been the sponsor of TV1, we've found we would have to do something almost exceptional in order to get any coverage of it.
That's an extraordinary acquisition to make. You're saying that the editors and the journalists at TV1 News are corrupt because they're doing things that the banks don't want. I simply don't believe that.
What I'm saying is that it is an organisation that receives sponsorship from a bank and is the least likely to cover us. Now, there may be a variety of other factors associated with that, but it's certainly something that I have noticed pretty regularly over the last couple of years.
It's easy to make the accusation, but very hard to prove it.
The thing is, though, if they didn't have a sponsor, there'd be no reason to make the accusation. The existence of the sponsor leaves them open to that.
They might not be all this ethical issue.
But surely any organisation that takes any money in advertising from any company could be accused of that, and that's the same with newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's one thing I want to ask you, Tim. There's another party who's been making use of the media to try and steer the debate, and that's the Governor of the Reserve Bank. He has said more than I think is usual. Reserve Bank governors are usually fairly cryptic. Alan Bollard has made the 18-month promise. He wants these things reported, doesn't he?
Yes, he's been very unusually outspoken, and I think rightly so. I mean, this is a very unusual situation. It is a delicate balancing act for him. There was a time a while back when I was quite critical of the Reserve Bank for trying to get the main high street banks to coordinate their pricing in a way, because he thought they were all charging too little interest, and he wanted them all to raise their interest rates. And I thought, well, you want the banks to collaborate? I don't think so. But this situation is slightly different, and his guidance to bank customers of what sort of environment to expect for the foreseeable future has been quite valuable, I think.
Do you think we're in for a war of words, given that Andrew and Alan Bollard and everyone else seems to be trying to communicate something at the moment?
I hope so.
The problem is, I don't think there will be a war of words between the banks and unions or politicians or lobby groups, because the banks are taking a very low profile on this. No one wants to stand above the parapet and say, hey, we're doing a great thing, because everyone then focus their attention on them. And if I have one criticism of the banks, it is they don't stand up and say, here's what the situation is, and here's why we've done what we've done.
Well, we may well see that. Anyway, that is all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Tim Hunter, Andrew Campbell and Bernard Hickey. After the break, art for art's sake.